Hi, I'm Lenora. I'm the creator of The Bitchy Bookkeeper.
Hi, I'm Kristen, author of The Age of the Child.
Hi, I'm Isabel, founder and firebrand of the Uprising Spark, and we are the three founding nun-mothers of Childfree Girls. In today's episode, we have a very special guest. Dr. Kimya Nuru Dennis is with us today. Thank you for coming. We're so happy that you're here.
Thank you. You all are awesome. Thank you for having me.
We are very excited about this. So before we get started, I want to do like a very quick introduction of who Dr. Kimya is for those of you who are listening or watching this episode and who haven't met her yet. So Dr. Kimya is the founder of 365 Diversity. She is a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary educator, facilitator, consultant, researcher, and community advocate. She's an expert on criminal justice system, mental health, suicide and suicidal self-harm, law enforcement, sexual health and freedom, and reproductive health and freedom.
And she childfree-by-choice.
Oh, yes, of course. But there's another thing that I wanted to add, and it is that you tackle, so Dr. Kimya tackles all of these subjects, all of these areas by adding the complexity of race, class, gender, and sexual orientation, just to name a few differentiating factors. Am I missing anything?
No, thank you.
And of course, Dr. Kimya is also a child-free-by-choice. She is invested in sexual rights and freedoms and reproductive rights and freedoms, as I just mentioned. And you conducted the first known study solely with child-free African diaspora in the U.S.
And around the world, yep. So we have respondents from Europe, continent of Africa, and yep.
And you also created and taught the first child-free college course.
Yeah, and some of the students in the class already had children, and they expressed that it's not like they wouldn't want to have their children, but they just wish that they had been taught about the choices, that you don't have to have children. Exactly. So those were the students with kids were the ones who were most outspoken. It was interesting and very nice.
That already had kids were the ones who were like, wish you had taught this before, wish I had actually, yes. Because there's this thing we have actually found out from many of our, the people that have come into the show and also people that we interact in social media, that many women, mother, or even people who are child-free, didn't know that they had the choice until it was too late either to be child-free because they're already moms, or they were just like, oh my God, this is like a huge revelation, which is my personal experience. Why do you think this happens? Why do you think it's so hard for people to grasp this as, see motherhood as a choice?
Yeah, I mean, so we're thinking about thousands of years why humans have existed and how humans have always been told that the reason to live is really to reproduce more humans, right? If you add religiosity to it, despite there being thousands of religions around the world, there are some mainstream religions, and those religions, most of them have some kind of story of why the purpose of females is to reproduce. So many Christians believe in Adam and Eve, this idea that Eve came from Adam's rib, and there are people who still believe that biological females, girls and women only exist to keep men company and to reproduce with males and men. And if you challenge that, they will use stories such as Adam and Eve, which is not fact, but it's a story. Humans have made stories for thousands of years to try to make sense of humans. And that's one of them. All it goes into it is just thousands of years of humans trying to make sense of our existence, make sense of our purpose. And when you add biological sex, gender identity, which, gender identity, there's not just two, but unfortunately that's what many societies insist. So when people try to make sense of all of that, then you add fertility to it. There are some people who will say, well, some people can pop out babies. That must be why females exist in the first place. And those of you who can't pop out babies, you are selfish, You have no reason to exist, and that's the long story. The more we challenge it, the stronger the pronatalism is, because now they have to defend uh, their workforce. They even like use that for capitalism and workforce.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate actually. And I mean, you just mentioned, women who can't be moms being regarded as less than.
Mm-hmm.
I actually read this morning, I was looking, one of these Facebook groups with Childfree people, and it was somebody who had shared in another group some text messages because she found out her boyfriend or husband or somebody was cheating on her. He had gotten pregnant, the other woman had gotten pregnant, and she had been struggling with fertility issues. And one of the things that he told her in these messages is, at least she can reproduce.
Mm.
Like, you're worthless because you can't have a baby. At least she's giving me one. So that's a really harsh thing to have to hear as a woman, that your value is based solely on your capacity to reproduce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we all have challenges, different types of challenges. And I want to ask you personally, as a child-free woman, what have been your challenges?
So it's interesting because when I never wanted to have a child, but the older I got, I was like, well, I guess it's gonna have to happen eventually. Yeah. So when I started the research in 2013, that was about a year or two after I had made the final decision to not have children. Why? Because, well, people always say, why don't you want children? I said, because I don't want children. And they want this like whole book of reasons. And I said, I don't owe you anything. So no, I'm not gonna waste the time. But some challenges have been interesting because I'm really good at telling people to get out my face. And so there have been times where people in professional environments and personal environments have tried to fly insults at me, but I'm actually pretty good at just telling them, sometimes in colorful words, to get out my face. So with relationships with friends and family, there was some tough stuff because they wanted me to be the Black woman baby person, and that's just not my personality at all. And then some people try to throw religion in there, and that's when I just had to say, I just don't care about your interpretation of God. It's just, I'm not interested. So many people are accustomed to us arguing with them, but also us changing our lives to accommodate their definition of everything. Like their definition of womanhood, they wanted me to change my life. Their definition of religion, they wanted me to change my life. And so I just started years ago telling people, I'm just so not interested in your definition of this stuff. Like me as a sociologist, criminologist, I know the history of people forcing their beliefs on everyone else. And then when everyone starts to comply, they're like, see, I told you what I told you was factual. Like, no, it's not factual. People have been forced to comply. That's not the same thing, right? And so it took me a while to just tell people, and this is what I told my students when I taught the course, choosing not to have children, choosing to adopt or whatever complies with your beliefs but defies your cultural background, it's going to make family angry and whatever else. And you're going to have to be content with your family being bothered. I just don't believe in living life as grown folks, doing stuff because mama said so or grandma said. Like, there has to be a point where you just truly don't care. Like, and I have to tell people all the time, like, I truly don't care what so and so thinks, and that defies my African diaspora culture because we're told to respect elders and live like so and so said, and that's part of our culture that I'm happy to dismantle. As for doctors, thankfully I had a really good gynecologist, and he's a white man, and he was like, look, he said, I don't believe in telling people what their reproductive choice should be. So he was really good with that. So I actually started sharing his contact information with other women who were interested in reproductive freedom. And so I was really happy to find some good doctors who did not spend time trying to say, you're going to change your mind. Because it was funny, when I first spoke with my gynecologist, 7 years ago, I had printed out all this stuff because I was going to give him a sermon. because darn it, he was going to try to fight me into reproducing. And he was like, Kimya, like, you got it. I was like, oh, I've got all this wasting ink. And it was relaxing though, because I really thought that I was going to have to go in there fighting for my rights. He's like, no, that's not. He said, the doctors who try to fight you for your body, that's not what we're trained to do. They're applying their own religion, gendered assumptions, sexuality assumptions into your life. And I asked him, I says, well, can we report them and get them in trouble? He says, you can, but unfortunately, a lot of this stuff is controlled by people who have the same views, and they're not going to get in trouble. So yeah, so my experiences, and then, doing this research, I received a lot of support. Now, the biggest problem, and I also did a YouTube video, I think about a year ago on this, the biggest problem is that child-free platforms are very white, very white, very, very white. And so I actually intentionally disconnected from those platforms. I'm still close with the creators of those platforms. We're still really close, but I don't like the platforms themselves because I explain to whites all the time, white supremacy is everywhere. It doesn't matter who you voted for. It doesn't matter what's happening in your womb. There's different ways that whites tell us that our race doesn't matter, such that I think one of the last instances was a white person responded to my research by saying, being child free has nothing to do with race. This false colorblindness, as though there's a such thing as any life decision that's not connected with our cultural background. And so I tolerated that a long time because Blacks are accustomed to having to tolerate white dominance everywhere. And then eventually I just said, I'm not doing this anymore. And so I actually did a video about that. But so yeah, that's a long answer to your question. I've had some difficulties, but I appreciate that I had a lot of mentors and people helping me through this process as well.
We're going to link up to the video that you just mentioned in our comments in case somebody who's listening to us wants to also watch it. Sorry, Lenora, I cut you off. So before I let one of my co-hosts ask you something, I just wanted to just build on something that you just, on your answer, because I had the pleasure of interviewing you for my podcast as well. And one of the things that you mentioned was that there were many people from the Black community who were child-free, but who were not pro-choice. So if they fell pregnant, that's it. Child freedom or child freeness, I don't even know which one is the correct one, but that would be the end of it. Is it still the case?
I would say it's still the case. And there's, as you know, there's not any research about this issue, unfortunately. There's conversation, so there's like qualitative stuff, but it's not on the record for most of it. And so that's one of the difficulties about child-free platforms, as you all know, is when you get someone in there who's anti-abortion, not pro-life, I don't use the phrase pro-life often, but like really just anti-abortion. They don't care about the struggles. All they care about is popping this thing out, right? So when you're in those child-free platforms tend not to be welcoming to people who are anti-abortion. And we've seen that on social media platforms over the years, where someone who's child-free, anti-abortion, they come in, they're like, well, respect my opinion. You all should just do an adoption if you get pregnant, that kind of thing. And that receives a lot of pushback from child-free people, as you know, because we're talking about reproductive freedom, sexual freedom. Don't tell me to grow this human inside me and eventually give birth, even if that means risking my life, because people are child-free for reasons including health. So among African diaspora, although many of us are pro-choice and we do abortion rights services, there are some people who are still very conservative in their religious beliefs. And that's the complexity of this. That's the complexity also being African diaspora. Now there are, it's interesting pattern that I was looking at in my research, that quite a few of the African diaspora women in my research are atheists. So many life experiences led them to abandon the Christianity that they were taught throughout their life. And that could also tie to their reproductive choices. And so when we say child free, we don't want to say there's only one way to be child free. However, it is difficult to push a child free agenda in terms of wanting us to have freedoms and wanting to make sure we train doctors accordingly without wanting there to be some kind of template. So that's the difficult part. And abortion access is already complicated, and it's even more complicated for Black and Brown people who it's a very religious belief that goes into it as well.
My question goes back to what you were talking about, critiquing the child-free community. I had heard you bring this up on a previous podcast interview you had done, and again, this also goes to what you said about the child-free community platforms mainly being white. And when I discovered the child-free community, which was around 2018, I did not know existed prior. I never thought about it from a race point of view. And so as I've gotten to know other child-free content creators who, and you know, of all nationalities, but specifically seeing the Black community speak up on it, it opened my eyes to, oh, okay, this is a white child-free person and a Black child-free person don't have the same experience. And that, like, just in the child-free section, not talking about other issues, just talking just from wanting to be child-free or choosing to be child-free. So I want to talk. I wondered if you can share a little bit more about your criticism or critiquing of the child-free community, like within those platforms, like Facebook. I've always found Facebook to be toxic. I joined at the beginning because that was the only thing I knew, and then once I discovered Instagram, I was like, oh, for me, Instagram has been a happier experience. But kind of because, again, talking about this. About race, and even in the last couple of weeks with all that has happened, I've found myself voicing as a mixed race person, trying to, like, I've always struggled with my racial identity, and it's still for me kind of swimming through how do I voice how I feel to Black people and to white people, and navigating the child-free community. Like, most of my followers are white, and it's never been an issue. I mean, I don't even look Black, so I mean it probably came to a surprise to some people that was my background. But as the three of us, we had said that we weren't going to speak publicly as a collective on Black Lives Matter because we are of different nationalities, and it was just unfair to just group us all together. We were going to talk about it from our own individual perspective. So how do we foster that within the child-free community, so it's not Black against white, you know, like
So I see what you're saying. So there's three things I want to highlight. Number one, Instagram is owned by Facebook,
right?
So
I know,
yeah. So I got banned from Facebook because whites reported my white supremacy posts. So when you see Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook announce intolerance for racism, that's complete white rhetoric. They absolutely love white supremacy at Facebook. It's just like any other social media platform where the Black voices are always expected to be within the comfort of white acceptance. Facebook's the same thing. So Instagram's the same thing as that as well. And also, by the way, when you say you don't look Black, that's based on this very narrow lens of how Black looks, right? So
yeah, and that's colorism that I've experienced the colorism from white and Black people saying, well, you look too, you know, you're too light to be Black, but you're too dark to be white. So that's
so I co-hosted a colorism event in the Black community and Hispanic community last year when I still lived in North Carolina, and that's something I addressed because when I look at you, I have Blacks in my extended family who are much lighter than you, and these are not descendants of consensual sex. Unfortunately, it's a result of white boys and white men raping African girls and African women. So that's one thing to challenge this notion of how does Black look, right? So there's many things that we have to challenge that landscape, which is of course separate from having this discussion if you want to have the discussion in child-free spaces. So I, as a sociologist and criminologist, I don't believe in giving white people tutorials. on race topics. Blacks have wasted centuries doing that. We have over 200 years of Black scholars such as W.B. Du Bois, Elaine Locke, Oliver Cromwell Cox, who have written materials that are collecting dust in libraries. And all whites care about is getting the cliff notes from us today, June 14th, 2020. You see that all over social media. Blacks are wasting time showing whites, here's what you should read. And I tell Blacks every day, if white people really cared about reading, white people would. White people are the ones who own these libraries. Despite thousands of years of libraries and universities around the world, white people are given credit for discovering libraries, discovering universities, discovering knowledge. White people will find a 6th century book in somebody's basement and say, oh my God, I found this European knowledge. But yet white people will not inconvenience themselves to go to a library or do a Google search and find free literature written by Blacks for centuries. So that's the problem in general. Whites are not held accountable by Blacks because Blacks have been tortured by whites for centuries by trying to hold whites accountable. We've been lynched, that still happens, thrown in prisons, fired from jobs. White people on social media are wonderful at contacting every organization on our resume to make sure we never get a job. And they actually email us to tell us, hey, I'll make sure you never get hired again. So I tell people, I don't explain things to whites because whites already know what they're doing. They're very darn good at it too. And social change doesn't happen as it pertains to race because whites intentionally want us to spend time teaching an intros to social course instead of working on the policies and procedures that we can actually change. And I used to teach intro to social. And I can tell you that grown adult whites who act like they don't know basic stuff, they're teaching that ignorance to young whites. Generation after generation, that's the foundation of school systems. That's the publishers that are publishing these books. That's intentional design. So even in child-free spaces, it's the same landscape of whites pretending to be innocent and not having any idea of the intentional design of white supremacy. Now whites are celebrating Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. And some Blacks are unfortunately celebrating that as well. As a Black woman social scientist, there's nothing to celebrate about that book. Blacks have explained the problem with white supremacy for centuries. Whites are not fragile. Whites might try to act fragile to distract us, but the fact that that book, White Fragility, is being celebrated is just another example of how whites want to distract us. Whites will say, I'm hosting a book club gathering. We're going to talk about white supremacy in that White Fragility book. They get together, have some wine, talk about the book, and Blacks are supposed to be like, yeah, you're making changes. No, you're going to a book club. That has no measurable purpose and no measurable results. So this is why I piss off white people and I make Blacks and brown people very uncomfortable because I don't play that white game. I dismantle that white game because that whole entire white game is based on white supremacy. It's just like when we talk about pronatalism, right? If we told child-free people every day to walk around holding your womb and explaining why you're not using your womb to pronatalists, right? Walk around every day and convince them, damn it. We wouldn't like that, would we? But Black and brown people are expected every day to walk around holding up our identity and explaining to white people, this is who I am. This is why my hair is the way it is. Here's what this symbol means. I'm a human. If white people really, really cared about that, then white people would have changed that centuries ago. All right? So I'll stop there. I'll just say I encourage these spaces, like child-free spaces. Don't waste time convincing whites to discuss these topics. Because if white people gave a damn, they would have initiated this themselves. We don't have to be the free tutorials for white people.
I have kind of a less complicated question.
Okay.
I love that you somehow managed to teach a child-free course, or to get a or to get someone to accept a child-free course. I can't even,
Hmm.
wow, because they clearly need that. I wish they had it in high school. What did it take to get that accepted, to get that taken seriously, to get someone to say, oh yeah, this should definitely be taught to young people?
Yeah. Well, thankfully, this is based on the college where I was faculty. It's the oldest continually operating women's college in the nation. And the reason they hired me in the first place is because they saw my full span of work. And then, of course, with the reproductive justice work, they were just really excited that they were helping me with the resources to do the child free research and then create the course. So all I had to do was just create a course description and get it going. And I also had Planned Parenthood present to that course and to the urban community course, which is a big deal because those courses were predominantly Black and Brown students. And it's profound because these Black and Brown students admit that this was the first time they actually got a space where they could talk about reproductive freedom, reproductive choices, and the resources that they need. So I would say give a shout out to Salem College because they intentionally helped me to be a trailblazer regarding that because they knew the disparities and being a women's college, they just really wanted to push that. Other schools might have difficulty with that process. It depends on their curriculum approval process. It also depends on the design of the program, um, making sure that it's not anti-natalist because there are some child-free platforms, as you all know, that are extreme in the sense of anti-natalism. And anti-natalism, by the way, as you all know, does not mean that we don't criticize parents. Like a lot of times when we criticize parents, people are like, oh, you hate parents. No, we're critiquing the process of parenting. But anti-natalism is the other side, where it's like, everyone stop having babies and I do believe the world is overpopulated, but I haven't gotten to the stop having babies part because I just know that's not going to happen anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah, so people who want a similar child-free course, they can contact me, but they have to think critically about the design of the course and make sure the course is acceptable for everyone to enroll. Because my course, like I said, I had people who already had kids, and they really loved the discussion because reproductive rights and the freedom to not have children is not relegated to people who don't have children. Everyone should celebrate freedoms.
Well, of course, because this goes down to the younger generations, because the three of us feel very strongly in reaching the younger generations, like the later teens, the early 20s, those, because we never had that support ourselves when we were those ages. So, we love having discussions with parents because hopefully that inspires them to have the conversation as, they're raising their own children, right? So it's important to not exclude parents from this conversation, and I don't think that gets, well, actually I know that doesn't get addressed enough, because a lot of times it's, yes, angry child-free people who want nothing to do with parents. Everyone kind of has their different reasons, but for us at least, we like having these conversations with parents because it affects the younger generations, which we are all for.
And I think there's a process though for a lot of us in being child free. I think many of us had that time when we were a little bit angry. We were annoyed,
Sure.
right? Because we think we start to reflect what have we been taught all our lives about the purpose for females existing, the purpose for girls and women existing. People citing Adam and Eve, this notion that Eve only was created because Adam was boring and needed company and needed something to do with his sperm, right? So, I mean, we're talking about thousands of years of the same routine taught in most cultures that are pronatalist. And so a lot of us did come across as outraged because, I mean, that's it. I think it's normal actually, because when you are underrepresented, it's normal to look around and be like, you know what, this is kind of annoying, right? And that's the thing about what you all are doing when you're reaching parents. You're reaching parents who are willing to have that discussion. Unfortunately, most parents are not. All they care about is having grandbabies. They don't care about the complexity of it. They have this Hallmark card thing going on where grandbabies don't come in. They don't think about what happens when children are born with health conditions. The parents are miserable and all that stuff. They don't teach that complexity of thousands of years of humans. What they teach is there's one way to be, there's one way to live, and everything's going to be awesome. And you add religion to it, people say, pray it away, and it'll be okay. And that's why I tell people, when we add religion to it, I'm a Jesus follower, as you all saw that video, YouTube video. I'm a Jesus follower. But my Jesus actually wants us to take accountability for the choices that we can make, with an understanding that we can't just do everything fly by night and then be like, wait a second, I was driving my car with my eyes closed and I got into a car accident. I thought God was going to save me. And God's like, look here, people, stop using me as an excuse to be dumb. And so the same thing applies when we're talking about this. It's people find all sorts of escapes for human accountability. And that's an example of that.
Yeah. We should have had you on the show when we did that interview.
I think you would have like, I'm leaving this meeting 5 minutes in.
Yeah, you wouldn't have stuck it out as long as we did. I mean, you were smart in that regard.
Yeah, I've just been quiet.
Listening, you talk about, younger generations and what we just discussed. It just boggles my mind that in the States and everywhere else, if you're in your late teens and early 20s, you are way too young to make a decision, such as, saying that you're child free, or even trying to access surgery, for your reproductive health. You're way too young, you're way too immature. However, if you get pregnant, you're not too young or too immature to be a mom. So there's that dichotomy that I don't get it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And that's what they'll call the natural health of it all. They'll say, well, if it was not meant to happen, it would not naturally happen. That's what a lot of people would say. And that's, of course, around the world. So, I mean, we have a little bit of research about the youngest people to ever get pregnant. And I think it's 9-year-old and all that stuff. And it's probably people younger than that for looking at fertility around the world for thousands of years. I consider that scary. But again, we look at spirituality, religion. There are some people who consider that a message from a higher power. So that's why when I say, when we're talking about freedom and choices and looking at laws and policies and procedures, we want to distinguish fact from belief systems. And that's the difficult part for humans, because one thing that we might interpret a 10-year-old getting pregnant from another 10-year-old. So they would claim that's consensual sex for two 10-year-olds, right? We might consider that something problematic. But there are people who would say it's problematic, sure, but it's a blessing now. So that's another difficulty when we're talking about ways to address this topic, how people think that blessings have tough packages and you got to open the package up, and that's the blessing. But
yeah. What I was going to say, women, or not women, girls, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old girls who are pregnant. I mean, the stories I've heard in my side of the world, it's usually rape. Let's call it what it is. It's usually older men taking advantage of these girls. And these girls don't know any better. They have been playing with dolls. They don't even know what it entails to make a baby even. It's just completely fucked up. Pardon my French, but it is.
Well, you know what? Okay, so I'm thinking of my grandma, my Black grandmother, because I have one of each. And she wrote a book that she distributed to family before she died. And my grandfather fathered 16 children. So it was a very large Black family in Alberta, Canada. Lived on a farm. And that, his family is massive. It was just, anyway, so I remember when I was early 20s, she told me, she gave birth to 11 children because there was no birth control. And so I was, I think 25, 26 when I read what she wrote in her book. And she met my grandfather. He already had a previous marriage. already had fathered 5 children, I believe.
Hmm.
And she knew nothing about sex. She didn't know how babies were made. I mean, you know, this was, I think she was born here in Alberta, Canada, but again, you know, this was years and years and years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But just reading her experience, and then, you know, she became a young mom, and then she had all these children, and just, we all go through life. I mean, all of us are privileged in the fact that we have information, we have education, and not that it's perfect, but I was just thinking of her experience. You know, like there was no birth control, no conversation of choice, and even my other grandma, my white grandmother, she was pregnant 6 times, had 3 children, and was married for 50 years, but there was no discussion about choice. There was no, you got married, that was it. The husband took care of you. Mm-hmm. You know, so I think that's what gets me angry. I mean, not in a bad way, because I've learned how to channel it through participating in the child-free community. So I've been able, the last couple years, I've been able to approach it from a peaceful place, because I've had a lot of time to work through. But just thinking of that generation, both my grandmothers, and I don't know if given the choice, like if they had a choice now, if they had a chance to know what we know, what would they have chosen? I mean, I can't, they're both gone now, so I can't ask them. And it would probably be, yes, I would have had kids, because how do you wrap your head around that when that's all you know for that length of time, given their ages?
I will say, though, something to keep in mind is that even with the existence of birth control now, and birth controls are technically improving scientifically, there still are cultures in Canada and United States of America that do not have access to those birth controls, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's something to remember. Birth controls have existed for thousands of years around the world. The effectiveness is the scientific part, but they've existed. But when we look at transatlantic slavery and immigration to North Americas, people were removed from their cultural origins where perhaps they might have been taught about some form of birth control. So that ties to a number of things. It ties to understanding the history, cultural history of reproduction around the world, and also ties to people having medical access. So when we're talking about birth control, we got to be honest that a lot of these reproductive centers are still not really reaching cultures, and most cultures of people are told using birth control is a sin. There are many Black Americans who believe that birth control is a form of ethnic cleansing and genocide. And they believe that in 2020, and that's the difficulty that I've had in this work, helping Planned Parenthood reaching Black communities, is Planned Parenthood is predominantly white, and the whites think that they are the bestowers of knowledge, unfortunately. And so there have been times where I've brought Planned Parenthood, particular offices of Planned Parenthood, to Black programs like Juneteenth celebration. And whites were very cocky in the sense of, oh, we know how to reach people. And at the end of it, I said, well, how did it go? And they're like, I knew everything would be fine. Everyone was fine. And that's what I told the whites. I said, well, actually, some of the Blacks came to me and complained about you all. You all did not get from behind the table I gave you. You know, the table is a place to sit, not to sit when talking to people, though. So a lot of times these organizations just really don't know how to reach people, and they think that things are a success because Black folk are not running around cussing everyone out. And it takes me saying, actually, some of the Blacks have told me that you really don't know how to explain birth control. Like you're saying, pick up this condom. Here's information about this. And when people ask you more, you're like, well, here's the pamphlet. And you don't even get up from out your chair, right? And so what happened with your grandma with all those babies, she might have done it again if she had access to birth control. But we find, unfortunately, that things are not as different now as we think they are when we start to actually look at what's going on in many of these communities, including in Canada.
Mm-hmm. So what do you say to younger Black women who would argue or who would say that abortion or Planned Parenthood or all of that is a way to try to erase Black people. Like, how do you, what do you say to them to say, no, that's actually not what it is. Here's how you can know that you have a freedom to choose this.
Yeah. So one thing to remember is that Black communities and African diaspora around the world are primarily very patriarchal, male dominant. So oftentimes it does not matter what the girls and women believe. It's this notion that if Black boys and Black men believe it, then everyone else has to comply, which of course I don't fall for that nonsense, but that's what's going on in most parts of the world. And so I explain this to Black men and Black women and Black girls and Black boys that I understand why you believe that. You know the history of Margaret Sanger. When Planned Parenthood presented to my classes twice, I asked them to start off with an explanation of how Planned Parenthood is not the foundation of Margaret Sanger anymore. I wanted them to include that because that's what our people are wondering a lot of times. So I explained that I understand, first and foremost, I'm a Black woman. So before the whole, PhD and all that other stuff comes in, first and foremost, I'm a Black woman. Okay, that's my identity. The other stuff is added to it. And that's important to clarify because Blacks have a tendency to believe that once we get an education, once we get a certain career, or whatever the case may be, that somehow our Blackness is buffered. And so I explained that when I walk around, I've been mistreated every day, mistreated by medical professionals because they assume that as a Black woman, I certainly can't understand my body. And that's when I have to tell them, actually, I specialize in health equity and I'm filing a complaint. And I do that for the Voice for All Blacks because I don't allow health facilities to treat us a certain way based on assumptions. So I explain all this to Black girls and Black women and Black females who do not identify gender-wise. I explain this because I want our people to understand, I know what you mean. I know why this feels like ethnic cleansing and genocide. I know how the problem if you see a billboard that says, hey, abortion rights, and it's conveniently in a poor, mostly Black community. Yes, that is problematic, definitely problematic. And I said, so I'm not going to debate with you because I know how you feel. Okay. Instead, the onus is on me to challenge these white dominant health organizations. And I'm going to challenge you, though, as Blacks, to say, okay, we have these beliefs, but could these beliefs be harming our bodies as well? And so when we throw it back and I say, well, let's talk about how these beliefs are harming ourselves, that's when some Black girls and some Black women have said, well, I do have a cousin who died while pregnant or while delivering. And I say, okay, that happened. How does that make you feel? What are some thoughts on it? And it's a difficult discussion. I mean, these discussions take forever. I mean, they're daily discussions. So what I just do is instead of trying to tell people that they're wrong in what they're saying, I say, actually, what you're saying is historically accurate because it was used as a form of cleansing of our people. But now let's talk about how we can do something to make that change. And when I say do something, it's not just within our communities and families. Also, I believe in changing the medical system because most of these medical students from undergrad to medical school are not taught anything about the history of the sciences. They're not taught about medical racism, scientific racism. They're told instead that Blacks are just difficult to reach. And that includes Black and African diaspora medical students and medical professionals. They're really taught that we're just a difficult people. That mixed with Black girls and Black women are strong, therefore we don't need painkillers. So that's the discussion I have. Like, I don't waste time. I don't tell people what you're saying is false in the sense of it not having factual origins, because our people are always told that what we believe is false, and that's not always correct.
I wanted to ask you something. I don't know how to tie in with the last subject, but this is something that we discussed briefly during our interview in my podcast, and it is you are expert in criminology and criminal justice. And you said there is, of course, a link between child freeness, child freedom, and like that subject. And I wanted to just go deeper into it because I thought it was so fascinating.
Yeah. So, by the way, I appreciate you. She created this image from our interview, and that image is actually on my website image section where it talks about how reproductive rights connects with when we talk about the criminal justice system, right? And so it's something that also goes back to Kristen's question, because when we're talking about reproductive rights, we're talking about overall freedoms. And in criminology, criminal justice, when they talk about racial disparities and gender disparities, they will bring up things like people, what they call instrumental crimes, crimes that are done for a purpose. Like if you were to steal something from a grocery store, the idea is you stole it because you needed it. Oftentimes when they say need, they're talking about people who have children, okay? So what I explain to criminology and criminal justice professionals at certain conferences is if we can comprehend need as it pertains to needing to support babies or children in a household, let's think about how this would be shaped if we addressed more reproductive rights and reproductive choices. And not when we talk about pedophiles and rapists being told by a judge, you're going to be sterilized, not that kind of thing. But instead saying, what if we told people throughout their lives that we can have reproductive choices and we can have access to healthy birth controls if that's what people choose to use? The question is, how would that shape people's behaviors? Could that possibly reduce people's need to commit instrumental crimes in which they're doing things to support their family? Because it also changes the definition of family. Like I tell people, not having children does not erase family. Like a lot of times people tell us, you're erasing family, with the exclamation marks. No, I have a family, right? It just changes the landscape of what we mean by family. And actually it diversifies it the way it's been diversified for thousands of years around the world. Like around the world, there are parts of the world where family never was limited to biological children in the first place. So I explain that though, because when we're talking about the criminal justice system, legal system, a lot of times when they look at extra legal factors in the court system, they don't care about the full span of family. They're like, does this person have children? That kind of thing. And I said, we really need to change that landscape and look at reproductive choices and look at the reason why people do what they do and how possibly that would change if we had more access to just health services. I mean, and we're talking about all types of crime, but especially when people are talking about types of crime that are committed disproportionately in Black communities, where we talk about, like if you look at certain cities, you can get city maps, and the city maps, you can access them for free from usually like the mayor's office or something like that. In the city map, you can oftentimes find the parts of the city that have the highest homicide rate, the most poverty, sometimes the highest traffic accidents if you're talking about those huge intersections also. And also you can look at things like food apartheid. So a lot of people prefer we no longer use food desert, but instead say apartheid. So we can make sure people know this was intentionally designed that people don't have food access. With that in mind, when you look at those parts of cities that have food apartheid, high homicide rates, poverty, these are oftentimes parts of the city that also have fewer reproductive choice resources. Even if they're located blocks away from one of those fancy medical centers that have bought up parts of cities, right? Even if the people in these neighborhoods might work at that fancy medical center, do these people in the neighborhood really have access to resources needed to make reproductive choices? So it's not saying that lack of access to reproductive choices causes people to do crimes. Instead, it's just like every other factor like poverty. It's a factor that can contribute to how people perceive the reality and perceive what they should do with their lives. And I really think that a few years down the road, if criminologists and criminal justice experts have access to data after COVID, after George Floyd, looking at job losses and all that stuff, they're going to find some shifts not only in unemployment, but they might find some shifts in certain forms of violence and crime as well. Unemployment's always happened in Black communities. So what does it mean now when Blacks who have had to rely on unemployment checks are now competing with middle-class whites who now are applying for unemployment checks because of COVID? Like, how does that shape everything? How does that shape hospitals who are busy with COVID people and they might not have the ability to now provide birth control and other resources? Like, how does that influence the prescription drug market as well? All of this connects, so yeah.
We also saw, and I don't know if that, I didn't look into that here in Canada, but how on social media they were saying, you know, Planned Parenthood isn't an essential service. You know, when we were at the height of what's essential, what isn't essential, I really didn't go too much into it myself. But I saw a lot of that discussion happening because I do follow a lot of pro-choice accounts, and that conversation definitely came up. It's like, well, is this isn't essential? Why is abortion essential? You know, why is that type of thing?
So when we say Planned Parenthood is not essential, I mean that's basically saying that other reproductive rights organizations are not essential. And I think something that Isabel and I also talked about when we did the last interview was when we're looking at things like gender dynamics in the penal system, like the prison system, a lot of times when they talk about women in prison, they talk about it within the landscape of women and babies, right? Like they talk about pregnant women in prison, all that stuff like that. So I do wonder if we were to start talking more about reproductive choices in prison and stop relegating women, the importance of women in prison to whether or not they are reproducing. Like, what about the childless women who are in prison? What about the child-free women who are in prison? Their health is important. Whether they get out of prison is important. It's not just whether or not people are popping out babies. So that also shapes how people view the criminal justice system, because a lot of times when you talk about gender and crime, women are mostly discussed as it pertains to their family structure. So I would be interested to see how researchers would change their theories and their sample sizes, even if they started looking at women beyond just whether they have babies, but other things too, reproductive choices.
One thing I thought was interesting that I wanted to ask if you would comment on was, well, there are a lot of interesting things, but it was an interview I listened to, like, where you were talking about altruistic suicide, and looking at different reasons for suicide and people not seeing that as necessarily suicidal behavior. And the example you used was a man saying he would die for his family, and that's something that in the patriarchal structure is actually held up as a sort of honorable thing. And is there a word for, you also discussed women who, people look with great fondness on women who are willing to die to have a child, or who would say, oh no, save the baby, let me go.
Yeah.
Now, would that be also altruistic suicide or altruistic procreation? And what do you think the effect of that is on women?
Yeah, that's actually really a wonderful question. So when the work that I do in suicide, I use Dr. Emile Durkheim. So he's old school French sociologist, died like almost a century ago, long time ago. And what he did is he provided these different forms of suicide using a social landscape. So I use this foundation, and thankfully I'm not the only sociologist specializing in suicide and suicidal self-harm who uses this landscape. And this landscape is important because when we do most of this work with psychologists, psychiatrists, and mental health providers, they tend to make all suicide a result of diagnosed mental illness and people's thought processes as pertains to mental health. So when you look at altruistic suicide, this idea of fighting for a larger cause, that can also change how we view racial variance in suicide. in Black community, for example, in non-white Hispanic communities, it's marveled when women in particular would say they would die for their children or they would die during childbirth. And most people would say, yeah, that's what adults should do. That's what parents should do. But that's when I explain, okay, it's okay to believe that, but it's still a form of intentional dying. You're dying for a larger cause, okay? Now, once you start using the word suicide, that's when a lot of people get uncomfortable and offended. But again, that's the whole foundation of what Emile Durkheim wrote about. When we're talking about suicide, there are different purposes. Some people will be trying to send a larger message for why they did what they did. So the same thing applies. If you're familiar with Kimya Moore, the model who won, was it Miss USA? She's now on Real Housewives of Atlanta. I used to be a real fan of Kimya Moore when I was younger. But Kimya Moore had a baby very late in life. And when you hear her talk about it, she went through a lot of problems, which are very common for Black women across various ages, but even more prevalent for older Black women. And she was celebrated by so many Blacks that she risked her life and trusted that God would just bring out this baby and save Kimya Moore's life as well. When I read that, I understand it theoretically. I understand the sacrifice, but I also ask people, what message does this send to our community and to future generations of females, girls, and women? That basically, if you're not willing to die, if you're not willing to torture yourself for a baby, then you're not really a woman, basically, or you're not really a biological female, or you're not even a good parent if the baby does get born and you live. And so that's why I address that when we look at suicide, because I want people to understand that this is not the romance novel of, I almost bled to death, but yay, look at the baby, It's presented as a romance novel, right? Especially when you add some religion to it, you stir it up, beautiful, romance novel and all that stuff. But I tell people, let's delve further into this, because we're talking about challenging the medical system. We're talking about challenging the police system, the criminal justice system. We have to remember that the medical system, the police system, these are not robots, these are people, right? And these people have the very same beliefs that most other people have. Like, most other people have these problematic beliefs and they're applying it to their own lives. But then they're pissed off because police officers are now applying it to entire police departments, So we can't change police departments and medical facilities without saying, what are these beliefs that are embedded in most cultures that need to be dismantled beyond just training police officers, but need to be challenged and dismantled so that we can actually change the practices and procedures of these entities. So that's why I addressed that regarding suicide, because these are forms of self-harm that are celebrated, they're marveled. Black women are called queens. Like, if you had a peaceful, it's one thing, give birth in water and it's peaceful, right? But, Black folk really love you if you talk about the torture that came with childbirth, because now you are a queen and a champion for our people.
Serena Williams is a good example of that, because she had, hers was documented on HBO. She almost died giving birth. Yep. And she is a champion, not for that reason, but begin with.
So she's showing her athleticism on the tennis court and as it pertains to her womb, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Which is very profound, because Blacks supported Serena and Venus Williams decades before whites thought that they were pretty enough to be on commercials, right? And of course, now Serena Williams is married to a white man. Mm-hmm. So that's just the complexity of what does it take for Black women's pain to be celebrated, not just by Blacks, but now it's celebrated by whites, because now Serena has been accepted into the white landscape of being not just a Black woman, but an awesome woman. Like, there's two different categories. right?
And her husband has stepped down from the Reddit board, which he helped create. So, I mean, I love them. I'm not knocking anybody, but I'm just, it's an interesting, you talk about how social media is white based, and we've had this discussion on the show about how children are social currency, and we see all these big white influencers. And the story I shared with you before we started this episode, you know, how white women are celebrated on these platforms, but Serena, given all that she has gone through and all that she has fought for and celebrated now on these white based platforms, I mean, it's there's ton. I mean, it's this whole long tunnel and
right. I mean, that's the thing. Whenever someone says something is mainstream and widely accepted, those phrases and words mean white majority, right? And that's something to remember for the United States of America and for the world. Around the world, when people say something is highly regarded or something like that, is usually this notion of whites have now started listening after ignoring for perhaps centuries. Now this is something that's important. And you see it, of course, now with the whole George Floyd and even COVID disproportionately impacting Black and brown people and LGBTQ as well. And within LGBTQ, Black and brown LGBTQ are the most harmed within that scope as well. These are things that we've known for a long time, a lot of research articles, all that stuff, but it doesn't get really attention until the mainstream whites say, oh, this is something important to now discuss. And so that's what's going on with Serena Williams. I'm glad that she's using that platform the way she is, but we also have to always say, why do we have to keep waiting for whites to give us permission before things really start to be addressed? It's going to keep being that way, because this goes back to what we discussed like 40 minutes ago, right? What it means when we're constantly told to teach things to whites and explain things to whites based on this falsehood that whites don't have access to this information until we say something on June 14, 2020, right? Like that falsehood that we just know whites have information if they wanted to learn. But yeah.
I just wondered if in your research you talked about the effects on families when they're, you know, you're telling everybody to have kids, and so everybody has kids even if they can't afford them, and so that leads to having to go find ways to get the stuff you need to take care of your kids.
Yeah.
Has your research ever touched on, or has it gotten into the area of the emotional and psychological effects on either the people who ended up with kids they didn't want, or on the children who weren't necessarily, you know, welcomed?
Yeah. So at least two of the African diaspora women in my research did address the tensions with their own mother. And so the research did take a very mental health scope, because it addressed feelings, negative emotions, and some of the women having potentially diagnosed mental health conditions that shaped how they did not want to pass that down to another generation. So there are two different parts of that. One, mistreatment from their own mothers, and another, what it means to not want to pass mental illness to a future generation. So that was discussed in my research, but it wasn't the full scope of the research, which is why future research would be necessary. But as you all know, this research is very difficult because it's already a very small group. And then within that small group, many people do not want to really participate in formal research. Like they'll want to talk about it, but then the moment it's on record, that's when a lot of people pull back. So that's the complexity of that too.
So before we wrap up, Kim, is there anything else you would like to add to our interview?
I just really appreciate you. The three of you are awesome. Keep doing what you do. Don't be unapologetic about it, while also knowing that we learn something new every day. We just don't have to be so cautious about learning and admitting we don't know. So I just appreciate the three of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure. So that is it for today, for this episode. You guys know you can actually find all of Kimya's links in the description of this episode. We're going to leave you her website, her YouTube channel, so you can go and get more information, because it is a very interesting subject. There's a lot to unpack here. It's, I have just, unfortunately, not a lot of time. You can also send us an email to childfreegirls@gmail.com if you have any questions, any comments. We'd love to hear from you. That's our email address.
You can also find us on social media. We are Child Free Girls on Instagram, Facebook, Pinterest, LinkedIn, TikTok, YouTube. Just search, just search Child Free Girls on Google and you will find us everywhere. That's probably the easiest thing to do.
Everywhere that kid Kimya off.
Exactly.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you here. Thanks again for your time.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, for my biggest thing would be just making sure people hold themselves and each other accountable. And for me, the theme is accountability. So I guess the question would be, how do you hold yourself accountable for injustices? That could be like reproductive injustice or any other injustice they're interested in. And they better not say, I host a book club.
So you heard the question. How do you hold yourself accountable? Write your answer in the comments below, or you can send us an email. We already give you our email address. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, y'all.
Bye. See ya.
Bye.
Bye. No, you say bye.
No, you say bye.
Oh my God, I'm leaving.
You leave first.
I'm going.
Bye.
Bye.